In the Timmy pantheon of big, badass beaters, a few greats come to mind. You've got Thromok the Insatiable, Maelstrom Wanderer, Progenitus. Well, I've got a new entry for your consideration. His name is Kresh the Bloodbraided. Hey guys, it's Shannon the Timmy from the Trinisphere, where Timmy, Johnny, and Spike battle over all things EDH. Today I've got for your consideration a budget Jund Aristocrat list. Be sure to like and subscribe. Liking lets us know to make more budget EDH lists, and subscribing gives you notifications whenever the gameplays using these lists comes out. So this sub $100 Jund EDH list is based around Kresh the Bloodbraided. Kresh the Bloodbraided is a 5-mana 3/3 with the ability that says, whenever another creature dies, you may put X +1/+1 counters on Kresh the Bloodbraided, where X is that creature's power. Notice it doesn't say whenever one of our creatures dies. Notice it doesn't say whenever an opponent's creatures dies. Whenever any creatures die, Kresh grows. This means with a single Fleshbag Marauder in main phase 1, Kresh can be swinging for 20 power in combat. So how do we build this budget list? As always, we're going to break it down into our 3 categories: our meat, our veggies, and the spice. For meat, we've got our aristocrat cards, cards that sacrifice our creatures to gain advantage. Additionally, we've got our reanimation cards, cards that benefit from having creatures in our graveyard. For our veggies, we've got our usual ramp, removal, and draw, and a few spicy adds that make Kresh a force to be reckoned with. So let's start with the meat, our aristocrat cards. We've got cards like Bloodthroat Vampire, Carrion Feeder, Dark Dweller Oracle, Emrakul's Hatcher, Viscera Seer, Wild Canter, and Yeheni Undying Partisan. Now we like cards like Emrakul's Hatcher because he generates 3 bodies capable of sacrificing themselves at instant speed to generate mana. Of course, their deaths will trigger plenty of the other effects in our deck. Additionally, my favorite overall is Bloodthroat Vampire. Some people prefer the Bloodflow Connoisseur, the +1/+1 counter cousin to this sack engine, but I think this is the perfect list for this explosive aristocrat. For example, when we swing with our entire board and they forget to block Kresh the Bloodbraided, Bloodthroat Vampire can sacrifice each of our block creatures. When each of those creatures die, they contribute their power to Kresh in the form of +1/+1 counters. But also, each of them, by being sacrificed, give Bloodthroat Vampire a +2/+2 until end of turn. This means Bloodthroat Vampire can easily become an 11/11 or a 13/13, and then Bloodthroat Vampire can sacrifice itself to contribute an additional 13 counters to Kresh the Bloodbraided, instantly gibbing an opponent who forgot to block. Moving on from the cards that do the sacking, we're on to the cards that love to see us sacrifice creatures. We've got Deathrender and Forebear's Blade. Deathrender is a favorite of mine because it has an ability that says whenever equipped creature dies, you may put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield and attach Deathrender to it. If you pair this with a sack engine, that is a card that can sacrifice for free at instant speed and as many times as we want, with another that draws us a card whenever a creature of ours enters a battlefield or dies, Deathrender allows us to churn through our deck, sacrificing creatures, putting creatures from our hand into play, triggering enter the battlefield, and leave the battlefield effects. Similarly, Forebear's Blade has an ability that says whenever a quick creature dies, attach Forebear's Blade to target creature you control. So this acts to give us an additional 3 power contributed to Kresh whenever one of our creatures die, and then it automatically re-equips to another body. So this can run Rickshaw through our Eldrazi Spawns and Scions, allowing them to sack themselves for mana, re-equipping Forebear's Blade to another, and contributing 3 power to Kresh while triggering our death effects. Speaking of some of those death effects, we have cards like Catacomb Sifter and Judith the Scourge Diva. Catacomb, of course, allows us to scry whenever one of our creatures dies, and Judith the Scourge Diva allows us to ping anything for 1 damage. This allows us to clear little pesky blockers out of Kresh's way. I really like Judith the Scourge Diva in this list because that +1/+0 to all the creatures is effectively like a budget Hardened Scales. Each and every one of our creatures has additional power to contribute to Kresh when they die, and that adds up very quickly over the span of a few turns. To wrap it up, we have our Voyeurs of Pawn of Ulamog and Sifter of Skulls. 2 cards which, when our non-token creatures die, they create Eldrazi Spawns and Scions to replace them, allowing the infinite meat grinder of bodies to continue on. Moving on to our final flavor of meat, our Reanimator package, we have cards like Anger and Brawn, cards which actively want to be in our graveyard. So putting Brawn in our graveyard is a no-brainer because Kresh, while routinely at 30/30, has no natural evasion. Giving it trample means we can completely overrun our opponent's defenses. Anger gives us the benefit of being able to cast Kresh from our command zone and immediately swing after sacrificing all of our creatures in main phase 1, completely obliterating an unsuspecting opponent who went shields down. To put those cards in our graveyard, we have things like Corpse Connoisseur and Tortured Existence. Corpse Connoisseur allows us to fetch Anger or Brawn out of our library to put in our graveyard, whereas Tortured Existence works like Survival of the Fittest, except interacting with our graveyard instead of our library. So we can discard Brawn or Anger out of our hand to recruit cards like Flashback Marauder or Disciple of Bolas. And to round out our third flavor, we've got Golgari, Fine Broker, Victimize, and Living Death. Living Death is probably the most powerful card in our deck and will most often be the way that we win our games. Because we're putting so many creatures in our graveyard at such a rapid rate, when we cast this card, we're going to completely overwhelm our opponents with all of our ETB triggered effects. Moving on from our meat, we've got our veggies. We've got our ramp, Deathrite Shaman, Elves of Deep Shadow, Elvish Mystic, Llanowar Elves, Soul Ring, and Wood Elves are a pretty generic package of cards that can rush us to 5 mana so we can get Kresh down as early as possible. But to back those up, we've got Dawn Treader Elk, Sakura Tribe Elder, and Yavimaya Granger, 3 cards that can sacrifice themselves to contribute to Kresh's cause, as well as trigger the various other effects in our deck. Onto the removal package, we have Decimate, Flame Tongue Kavu, Indrik Stomp Howler, Rakdos Charm, and Reclamation Sage. Rakdos Charm, a very versatile EDH card, but especially important to have in here so that we can exile somebody's graveyard before we cast Living Death to ensure that we have the winning board state when it resolves. We back those up with the evoking cards Ingot Chewer, Shriekmaw, and Spite Bellows. These are basically removal spells that not only contribute to Kresh when they kill our opponent's creatures, but are creatures that die themselves when they're cast, which means Kresh gets double the power, triple the power they normally would. Similarly, we have Caustic Caterpillar, Fleshback Marauder, Merciless Executioner, Plague Crafter, and Slum Reaper. All cards which are honorary evokers because very often we'll be sacrificing they themselves in order to contribute to Kresh's power. On from removal, let's talk about our draw. We have Disciple of Bolas, Evolutionary Leap, and Yavimaya Elder. Evolutionary Leap can turn our Eldrazi spawns and scions into tangible cards, which is a huge advantage, and gets completely out of hand when paired with cards like Deathrender. We also have Fecundity, Grim Haruspex, Midnight Reaper, and Smothering Abomination, all cards that will draw us whenever one of our creatures die. Fecundity even works with Eldrazi spawns and scions and other tokens. Alright, moving on, we have a few rummaging cards. Azra Bladeseeker, Hazaret's Monument, and Rick's Mighty Reveler allow us to discard things like Anger or Brawn or late game lands so that we can keep hitting gas. And to round it out, we have a few more in the form of Dusk Legion Zealot, Elemental Bond, Elvish Visionary, Guardian Project, and Read the Bones. With Elemental Bond, you'll notice that many of the cards in our deck have power 3 or greater, and Guardian Project is just an excellent draw engine, turning every single thing we play into a cantrip. Now, after our veggies, we go into our spicy choices that make this deck list absolutely bonkers. To start, we've got Gerard Golgari Lichlord. Considering we're filling our graveyard with bodies, he's going to be enormous. But also, Kresh routinely becoming 30 power or greater synergizes great with Gerard's activated ability, allowing him to sack Kresh to deal 30 plus damage to each opponent, effectively killing the entire pod out of nowhere. To back him up, we have a bit of an infinite combo. I'm not a big fan of infinite combos, but these cards were added in separately, and I just found out they synergized together, so we ran with it. We put Murderous Redcap in here along with Rhythm of the Wild. Now, normally Murderous Redcap is just a removal spell, capable of being sacked and recurred on its own, so it can be sacked twice and pop some of the smaller creatures our opponents play. Rhythm of the Wild increases the power of all of our creatures by giving them +1/+1 counters when they come into play, or giving Kresh haste when he comes out of the command zone. But when paired together, the +1/+1 counter from Rhythm of the Wild can negate the -1/-1 counter from Murderous Redcap, which means we can sacrifice Murderous Redcap infinitely, dealing an infinite amount of damage. If that's not your jam, then we round out our spice with Ogre Battle Driver and Primal Force Mage. Both of these cards create ETB triggers when one of our creatures comes into play, increasing their power. In the case of Ogre Battle Driver, it gives that creature haste. In the case of Primal Force Mage, it gives it +3/+3. So Primal Force Mage is an absolute insane card in this deck. When we evoke things like Spite Bellows, we can stack it so that the +3/+3 resolves before the Spite Bellows kills itself to its own evoke trigger. That means instead of being a 6/1 when it dies, it's a 9/1 when it dies, contributing a huge amount of power to Kresh. The same goes for things like Eldrazi spawns and scions. Instead of coming in as 0/1s or 1/1s, they're coming in as 3/4s or 4/4s, instantly sacrificing themselves for mana while growing Kresh to an enormous size at a crazy rate. Alright, cooling down from the spice, let's talk about the lands. We jam as many rare lands as we can in here. We've got Canyon Slough, Cinderglade, Game Trail, Graven Cairns, Llanowar Wastes, Mossfire Valley, Sheltered Thicket, Smoldering Marsh, and Tainted Wood. But the one relevant spell land that we run in here is Skarg the Rage Pits. It's our budget Kessig Wolf Run. This card, giving Kresh Trample, allows us to completely obliterate unsuspecting opponents. Alright guys, that rounds out this budget Jund Aristocrat list at $95.11. Let me know if I missed anything that you think I could jam in here. This deck is a ton of fun to play. I've played it a bunch of times against a lot of opponents, and at first they scoff when they see Kresh, but within a few turns they are scrambling to not die to commander damage. Alright guys, that's a wrap from Shannon the Timmy. As always, it's not about winning, it's about sending a message. Peace.